Great. Before we get started, there's a phrase in English called eating your own dog food, which means kind of practicing the thing that you're going to be talking about. So I made this entire presentation on my iPad, if it makes a difference. It's very hard, harder than it should be. Like Bernd said, I work for a company called Mint Digital. We're based in London and New York. It's quite hard to describe what we do. Some of the stuff we do, we try and kind of bring people together online to make interesting things, whether that's for television or for brands. But we are also finding that our business is changing as our living rooms and what's in our pockets is changing. So we spend a lot of our time doing this nowadays, which is to try and figure out what these devices and these things around us mean and how we're going to design for them. And hopefully get to products like this. This is something we did for the World Cup during the summer called Live Pitch. What it does is it visualizes what happens in a football game in real time. So the line you see in the middle is possession. It divides the two teams, and each player is represented as a square. So in real time, you're able to see kind of what's happening in the game, and each player is represented as a square. So as their actions they sort of do stuff on the pitch, they get bigger or smaller in size according to what they're doing. But today's about magazines. As Bernd said, I haven't really ever designed a magazine or had the chance to work in one, but both my parents are journalists, so I sort of grew up in newsrooms. So this is coming very much from the point of view of someone who kind of makes things on the internet, but has real love for magazine and print. So, and it's also quite loose. I mean, all of it's theory, so I'm also going to try and keep it quite short, so let's just have a discussion about it afterwards, ask you questions and stuff. This chap, Edward Cave, who's credited for kind of using the word magazine for the first time with this in London, the Gentleman's Magazine, in kind of mid-1700s, I think. So it's a view of the weekly essays and controversies, and also, a section on the melancholy effects of credulity in witchcraft, which sounds quite fascinating. But in terms of kind of going way back in history, one of my favorite resources nowadays for looking at this stuff is actually Google Books, who are archiving a lot of the magazines. In the old, I actually took Popular Science as an example today. So this is the first ever copy of Popular Science in 1872. And it doesn't really look much like a magazine or what we would now describe as a magazine. Yet, depressingly, the content seems familiar enough. They're talking about climate change in 1872, so that's something to think about. And sort of going through the history of that, you're starting to get the ads come on. I'm as good a man as Jim. I think his wife is sleeping with Jim. I think that's what's going on. And then advertising gets really quite scary. I found this image in the 1930 copy of Popular Science. So, yeah, apparently what the grown-ups judged for themselves for Christmas was Turkish cigarettes and Santa smoking them. And you sort of see that progression through kind of what's going on, the 60s, the 80s, and kind of where we're getting to in the 90s and the 2000s, and then all the way over to this, which is what it looks like now. And I guess the question is this exciting? And for me, the answer is yes and no. I think one way to look at it is this is exciting as this was maybe 250 years ago. And that's either very exciting when you look at it or very boring. And I think both of those are okay because the medium itself is what we always kind of use for content, and whether that's paper or a screen, I don't think matters that much. But I think what's probably quite exciting is kind of what that means and kind of what's that going to become. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about those. This is a quote by Paul Graham, who runs a thing called Y Combinator, which is a startup, and he says many, if not most, of the special purpose objects around us are going to be replaced by apps running on tablets, which is quite depressing or exciting, again. You're already kind of seeing this happen. We used to have things like GPSs. We don't anymore because, well, this has one in it. And same with my iPod, I don't have one anymore because this has one in it. So we're sort of seeing the convergence of devices come into effect. And I think that has an effect on what's going to happen around magazines. And even before, I think the technology itself isn't so much the exciting part, because that's always been an enabler. Paper in itself is a technology. It's what people use to kind of convey data and information. I think what is probably interesting is kind of us as makers of this thing, what we're going to do. And it's not so much about how we're actually going to design them, because I think we'll figure those things out. But it's much more about sort of what these things are going. So I want to talk about 3 things around that. And the first was kind of attention and consumption patterns, excuse me. So magazines are quite strange in the way we sort of go through them. I'm sure all of you do this. The sort of life cycle of a magazine is multiple. You grab it, and your first pass through it is probably about 2 minutes, where you just do the whole flick thing and you go through the entire thing. And then on your second pass, you maybe do it a bit slower, maybe an article catches your eye, but every time we go through it, we actually consume more content each time. So the kind of attention we spend on how much we consume of it changes every time we use it, which is quite unique in a way, because that's not really the way we sort of, for example, look at web pages. You don't ever go to a web page and you get kind of just scroll through it and then come back to it a day later and maybe read bits and then come back a week later and read the whole article. That's not really what we do. So it's quite unique in terms of that. And what sort of tablets mean for this is we're sort of comparing that to, I read something the other day which said, for example, people using tablets have a lower heart rate compared to people using a computer or their iPhone. So they're actually in a more relaxed state while they're using it. And that's the whole sort of idea behind kind of what we call kind of laptops and PCs, lean forward computing, where you actually have to, physically lean forward to use them. And with the tablet, it's much more of a lean back experience, where you're actually in a state of almost relaxation, perhaps in a state of flow, kind of as you get to it. And that is actually kind of a perfect analogy of how you read a magazine, because it is content designed to be consumed passively, and it's meant to grab all of your attention at the same time. You don't really have any distractions while you're reading a magazine. Whereas with a tablet, or at least the kinds that we have, there's always the temptation to do something else because they do so much. As I'm reading an article, I'm quite tempted to check what's going on Twitter, or you get a ping from one of your friends. So the devices themselves are quite encompassing. So I think one of the things we're going to have to think about as designers is how we actually design content that has the potential to be interrupted, and kind of how you go around looking at that. And I don't really have any answers. I think it's more of a sort of thinking about, but a couple of the things we've been sort of thinking about is maybe not completely related, but this idea of reactive interfaces. So much of the stuff we've designed has been designed to be used in kind of one setting. There's one use case for it. But these devices are actually smart enough to kind of know when they're being used and when they're not. For example, this has an accelerometer in it, so it has the potential to know when I've got it picked up or when I sort of put it down flat to a surface. So I think one of the things quite exciting about that is designing content to take advantage of knowing what state it's in, which is something we'd never be able to do before. Does an article look different when it's laid flat on the table and it's kind of used as it's almost an attention seeker in itself. It's sort of trying to make me interested in reading it, but when you pick it up, it's actually completely different, and it's aware that it's sort of being consumed. So how do you sort of go around and kind of take advantage of that is, I think, quite exciting. And this idea of consumption patterns being different, the first pass through the magazine, the second pass, the third pass, it's going to be quite interesting to think about how we lay our content to maybe take better advantage of that. Magazines don't have the luxury of changing according to, once it's set, it's there. But you almost have the capability to think about how people consume these things and design for it, being aware of that. So if the thing that people do when they first pick up a magazine is go through the entire thing in a minute, maybe design so that people can actually do that in 1 minute, and then kind of think about how the content comes into play. So yeah, I think that's probably going to be one of the most interesting areas, kind of us. You know, stuff we've done so far very kind of naturally is taking what we know and applying it to the new medium, but kind of going forward, it's going to be really interesting to see how we take advantage of the medium's capabilities itself. Second area was kind of this idea of editorial versus social curation. Probably for the first, not really for the first time, but the first time you're seeing it in effect is the idea that magazines don't have to come from a traditional media source, so they don't necessarily have to be something that's produced by media, but it can be a collection of things that either my friends have put together or is put together algorithmically for me because of the people I follow. And it's a funny thing, this, because as far as we're concerned, a magazine is something that's quite defined in a way, and it's defined by the editorial itself. You know, each magazine in itself is a brand of some sort, and you kind of identify yourself with that. You know, the analogy I use for this is shopping bags. When you go shopping, part of the experience is walking out of that shop and carrying the bag of whatever it is you bought. The bag itself is part of what you're sort of associating yourself with. And a magazine has a similar quality because you're making a statement about what it is that you're sort of putting out there, and you're saying, this is the thing that aligns with my views of the world, and it's a brand in itself, so you're sort of buying into that. Something that's kind of put together via software or social curation doesn't really have that effect because it's not really a brand that other people can buy into, but it's very much personalized for you. So does that change how we think about what a magazine is, and what sort of effect does that, and do they even work together? I think kind of my guess is there's probably always going to be a space for editorial magazines because of just who we are. I think we as humans quite like information presented to us in a nice, neat way, arranged by kind of someone, and you kind of have the effect of people having spent the time to kind of put it together, whereas the sort of curated stuff is very much perhaps more interesting because of how current and how relevant to me it is, but I think what it probably lacks for a lot of people is the idea of what it is and the idea of why we like magazines. You know, why do I buy 6 magazines a month? It's not because I read them all cover to cover, but because each of them gives something to me that maybe other things don't. And then that very much leads into just what a magazine is and where that's kind of going to go. And you know that even on that slide, you've got kind of 3 things: Flipboard, which is a socially curated magazine for the iPad, and you've got traditional magazines, and you've got newspapers. And we were looking at that sort of copy of Popular Science earlier from 1872, and if I had that with me today and I said to you, look at my magazine, you'd probably say, well, that's not a magazine, that's just a document you've printed out. It will be interesting to see if people will say the same thing in 10 years' time about what we call magazines today, or in 20 years' time. It's this idea of, you know, we attach words to things to define them because that's just what you do, but those definitions are very organic and they change, and I think you've seen that change happen to magazines over the last 200 years or so, but we're entering a period of kind of very fast change about it. And taking those ideas about kind of what curation means and what editorial means and what the medium itself means is going to each shape what sort of we define as a magazine going forward. And it almost doesn't seem implausible that what we call a magazine today will not be what our future generations will define as a magazine. And really, that's kind of the note I wanted to end on. It's not like magazines are going to go away. They've been very successful so far. They have a very sort of symbiotic relationship with advertising, and advertising isn't going anywhere. So in terms of where these things goes, I think for me the most fascinating thing is this has sort of happened for about 250 years, and then what we're talking about today has happened in the last 18 to 24 months or so. So just think about that for a second. It's almost like you've got the entire history of the magazines, and then this journey we've started on redefining what it means. And we're so early at that, so early. And it's just going to be so fascinating to see what we come to define magazines as. And thank you, that's all I had.